At this time of transformational change, CGIAR requires evidence-based and independent advice more than ever. The Independent Advisory and Evaluation Service, IAES, supports CGIAR as it delivers research that addresses the interdependent challenges facing today's world. IAES provides operational support as the secretariat for two independent bodies of CGIAR, the Independent Science for Development Council, ISDC, and the Standing Panel on Impact Assessment, SPIA. The IAES also implements CGIAR's multi-year independent evaluation plan to support the CGIAR System Council's need for high-quality independent evaluations. Overall, the aim is to support decision-making across the CGIAR system. The IAES and the two independent bodies it supports facilitate and provide external, impartial, and expert advice related to strategy and positioning, process and performance evaluation, and impact assessment. To learn more, visit ies.cgiar.org.
Welcome to this gLOCAL session, panel discussion on how evaluations contribute to addressing the greater societal issues, the case of the CGIAR Gender Platform. We're excited to have you with us today. I am Karen Jayina. I work as a Senior Evaluation Officer for CGIAR IAES's evaluation function. I will be your moderator for today. This session will be led by three discussants there on the screen. First is Svetlana Negroustoueva. She leads the evaluation function of IAES. We have Donna Podems, who's a team lead for the CGIAR Gender Platform evaluation, and Sonal Zaveri, a member of the IAES's evaluation reference group. To begin with, the objectives of today's session are twofold. On the one hand, we want to showcase some of the methodological insights, the approaches used in the gender platform evaluation. On the other hand, we want to spur dialogue and conversations and exchange ideas about using this evaluation as a case in point and draw lessons to inform the larger agri-food systems and connect with broader societal issues. In terms of the structure, today's session will be structured as follows. We have 3 lead questions to be taken each by the 3 panelists in a staggered way. So the first 2 lead questions will be taken by each panelist in about 22 minutes, after which we have a 5-minute intermission where we'll have a quick fire Q&A and a Menti poll. And this will be followed by the 3rd lead question to be taken by the 3rd panelist, and a final 10-minute Q&A session. As time will not permit us to go around the room and get to know more about the participants, may I invite you at this time to please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are, where you're joining from, which organization you're affiliated with, and what you want out of today's session. Well, let's dive in. The world is currently facing an unprecedented and protracted food and nutrition security crisis, which has been exacerbated by conflict, climate change, and other factors. More than ever before, it is important to address the underlying causes of hunger and malnutrition, which are often linked to social inequities, such as gender inequality. In agri-food systems, gender inequality is endemic. Women and girls often face numerous barriers to accessing resources, markets, and decision-making opportunities. This not only limits their own potential, but also undermines the productivity and sustainability of the entire food systems. It is against this backdrop that the CGIAR's gender is acronym for Generating Evidence and New Directions for Equitable Results. Gender Platform seeks to synthesize and amplify research, fill gaps, build capacity, and set directions to enable CGIAR to have maximum impact on gender inequality, opportunities for youth, and social inclusion in agriculture and food systems. The platform was established in January 2020, and it recently transited to encompass an expanded mandate covering youth and social inclusion. CGIAR's independent advisory and evaluation service, IAES, is coordinating an independent external evaluation of the platform. The evaluation aims to assess the platform's progress from January 2020 to October 2022 to document lessons and operational practices and provide forward-looking recommendations for the newly transitioned platform. Now, in framing, we'd like to take a step back in conversation with the lead of the evaluation function, Svetlana Negroustoueva. What lenses and approaches are integral in conducting evaluations that have larger societal underpinnings, such as that of the gender platform? Speak to us a bit about some of the practical approaches used in operationalizing this in the evaluation process. Over to you, Svetlana.
Thank you, Karen. I believe the slides have to move a little bit further. Thank you. No, this one and the next one. I see in the list of participants, we have one member of the team as well, Tanya Struther. So I just want to acknowledge her and welcome to other participants. So to get us started, I wanted to give a little bit of a background on what CGIAR is and how all of this evaluation and the approaches are grounded in CGIAR's work. Next slide. So CGIAR is an agricultural for research development organization. It's a partnership for a food secure future dedicated to transforming food, land, and water systems in a climate crisis. And the work of CGIAR is delivered through largely research centers that are based in the Global South. And if you might have not heard the word CGIAR before, you might have heard actually the names of the centers that the work is being delivered to, such as ILRI, which is a hosting entity for this particular gender platform, which is based in Kenya, for example, and others spread around the world. The CGIAR's work on the next slide is driven by the new research and innovation strategy, which is called 2030 strategy. And of course, it coincides with the timing of the SDGs. And to at the core of our work, of CGIAR's work, is science and research, because it is a research for development organization. The definitions of research and science do on the left come from the strategy, and you can tell the highlighted circles how core to this organization are the research and science, and the work is delivered through initiatives and platforms. And the screenshot on the right is just examples of a couple of initiatives that are delivery vehicles for the work. On the next slide, we'll cover just the introduction to the platform itself. Gender Platform is one of the 4 platforms that was operating in the previous CGIAR portfolio, and its work was delivered through 3 modules: alliances, evidence, and methods. And we will be covering some of the methodological aspects related to some of the specific modules, but this is to stay tuned for the final report. So we will not be discussing in detail work and results. Next one. It is very important that, of course, our work is delivered through our teams, the evaluation teams, and with quality assurance and contextual grounding and additional rigor added through evaluation through peer reviewers. And here we wanted to kind of showcase the slide to show the representativeness of diverse types of team members, and to make sure that there was a balance in different in gender and in expertise across the evaluation team and the peer reviewers. So that speaks to one of the principles of conducting evaluations by IAES according to evaluation framework and policy. Please continue. So for integrating multiple frameworks and approaches, which is what this evaluation has done, we'll cover a couple of approaches and specific kind of methods and novelty methods. And I will specifically focus on evaluation guidelines on QR4D, which is the quality of science evaluation guidelines, and the evaluability assessments. All of the work that has guided this evaluation approaches and methods comes from the evaluation policy and framework, which were launched last year. And basically the guidelines and the methods used are operationalizing those. And theory-driven evaluations, UFE, participatory and feminist evaluation that was uniquely placed for this particular evaluation. So next, on the next slide, we want to show and showcase how the evaluations take place in CGIAR and kind of the context, because again, this is research for development organization. So the science, the research aspect is very important at the start of delivery of any intervention, be it initiative, program, or the platform. And the ISDC, which is Independent Science for Development Council, reviews proposals for initiatives. Then the evaluation function, and we're focused on us, comes in during the advisory real-time process performance evaluations, and using the guided by the frameworks and the tools that we have been developing. And of course, all of this takes us to the use of evaluation results for decision making, which this evaluation will do. Next. For the first, one of the novelty methods that we have used for the first time in our work in our office, but it is increasingly becoming popular in the evaluation community, is the evaluability assessments. And it was done because the evaluant, the gender platform, the funders of the CGIAR work, and of course of this evaluation, they wanted to be confident that all the inputs were there for the conduct of an evaluation that meets everybody's needs, and also ensure the presence of credible and rigorous evaluability assessment would have ensured that recommendations would be framed to respond to objectives of this evaluation. So the findings are presented in the inception report. And on the next slide, I will just highlight the fact that this approach was joint. It was focused on learning. It was a self-availability assessment was at the core. So the gender platform director and the male representative conducted it together. And then they were the knowledge was integrated with our assessment from our team. And the conclusion was that the platform was ready, and there was a couple of elements that were considered in recommendations. For example, the presence of the male expert that is eventually would be covered in the recommendations in the final report, which you will see in a month online. Anyway, so this was a really important exercise for us. And on the next slide, I'll show another novelty, which is the application of the quality of science evaluation guidelines. This is also very unique to CGIAR as a research for development organization. And you see the mapping of the standard evaluation criteria on the right, and kind of on the left, quality of science is an additional criteria that is featured in the evaluation policy of CGIAR. And it helps us bring out this research and science aspect to the work. And in this particular evaluation, it helped bring together evidence related to the outputs. You can see on the left one of the dimensions of the framing of the quality of science evaluation criterion. And on the next slide, we'll provide the example of how it was considered, what questions were asked around the outputs of the platform and how they were analyzed by our expert team. And Tanya Strathers is one of the members who did particular aspect of the evidence module. So eventually she can also help us answer some of the questions. So you can see that the focus here is on the outputs. And on the next slide is the kind of the example of what was considered as outputs. Those were evidence explainers that were produced by the gender platform, and the evaluation team analyzed them using the quality of science framework. With that, I will conclude my intervention and give floor to our next presenter. And I hope that you will have a chance to read the report eventually, highlighting the use of these novelty methods. Thank you. On to Donna.
Thanks, Svetlana. Yeah, I'm very excited today to talk about the methodology. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we went about about doing the evaluation, but I'm going to particularly focus on the feminist approach that we used and some of the lessons that we took away from that. So on the next slide, I think people, even after we wrote the methodology, the team and I wrote the methodology for the CGIAR, we still had feedback from reviewers around why do we need a feminist approach? What is a feminist approach? One of the questions I wanted to start talking about is around the fact that there are different kinds of feminism, and we're very aware of that, particularly with this being a global evaluation, of not putting forth a particular kind of feminism to influence the values and decisions that we made throughout the evaluation. As many of us know, there's liberal feminism, ecofeminism, radical feminism, social feminism, and so many more. And they all bring different kinds of beliefs to feminism. But one thing that they all have in common are these three beliefs that you see on your screen. That there should be equity amongst humans, that inequity leads to social injustice, and that gender-based inequalities are systematic and structural. So when I talk about the feminist approach that we used, it was underpinned by these three kinds of beliefs. Next slide. And yeah, so we also got the question on the feedback after we wrote the methodology. Well, why a feminist approach? Why not a human rights approach? In the methodology that we designed, we actually used 4 different kinds of different methodologies, with feminist being the one that underpinned how we made value decisions. And when people ask that question, I always like to just respond and say, human rights evaluation approaches are important, as are many other kinds of approaches, but a feminist approach is still needed. And I'm going to say, for example, the fact that you're looking at on the screen, right? I mean, across a woman's lifetime, 1 in 3 women, which is around 736 million women, are subjected to physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. That's a pretty high figure. And when people start to get their attention, I start to get people's attention with that fact. There's some other facts out there. Like, let's look at the fact that while men were 2.4 times more likely to die from COVID-19, women are were twice as likely to be killed by their partner during lockdown. And those stats came out of Europe, but out of England in particular. And one from the States I found that was around American women serving in the US Army in Iraq or Afghanistan were more likely to be raped by their comrade than to be killed by an enemy. So there's a lot of reasons why a feminist approach is important. It was particularly useful for this evaluation, of course, looking at a gender platform and considering the different kinds of structural and power dynamics that we needed to analyze and assess. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the approach used a feminist evaluation, and in a particular kind of feminist evaluation. One of the approaches, methodologies that I'm working on now and hope to have fully published by next year is a feminist principles evaluation. And what you see are the principles in front of you, and I don't have time to go through them all, but these 8 principles are the ones that guided us through making our methodological decisions, through how we committed to ourselves in the field, and to how we actually engaged with people. There's a few here I'll point out because we actually I learned some big lessons about these tenets, about these principles, and how they needed to be adjusted. So we had a lot of learnings from this, which I'll go over in a moment. Next slide. I think one of the points I really wanted to focus on in this presentation as well was that a feminist evaluation is not always useful for an evaluation on gender. Just because something's looking at gender doesn't mean that a feminist approach is the one that we should be using. So what are the questions we thought about before you use a feminist principles evaluation? And we kind of went through the 6 questions before we really landed on saying, yeah, this is the main one that we're going to use. I mean, did the context warrant it? Is there some element in the intervention that was dealing with power relations and issues around inequality? The third one, how would the evaluation process be enhanced? And we talked a lot about that amongst the team. 4, how would decisions around data collection benefit? 5, what about the analysis? Would that benefit? And finally, how would FPE influence communications of findings? So we actually went through looking at these kinds of questions before we decided, actually, yeah, a feminist approach to the gender platform evaluation was definitely one that we thought was a very strong way to move forward. Next slide. So it's always, as evaluators, we also need to be critical and of what we do. And the only way that we're going to improve the feminist methodologies out there is not by hiding them, not by calling them a gender approach, but by actually saying, look, we used a feminist approach and here's where it needs to improve. Some of the principles, the lessons I learned from doing this in particular were that some of the principles need to be changed. I think the initial principle around capacity building, we need to get rid of that word. We need to use a more feminist, more empowering word around co-learning and so on. So some of the wording needs to change around the principles that I've just presented to you. We also need to add in a principle around self-reflection and positionality. Those were in the original set that I developed. They were taken out through doing this evaluation with the CGIAR on the gender platform. I'm realizing how much that principle actually needs to go back in. The second bullet also, as I mentioned earlier, we did get a bit of pushback around why use a feminist approach. And I think becoming clear around what feminist principles evaluation is and how it benefits an evaluation is something that I need to do better next time. The third bullet, adding an additional section on the methodology on how a feminist evaluation influences data inquiry specifically. Most of the questions came back on this. So I think, again, a stronger methodology, a stronger explanation in the FPE approach around data inquiry is where people seem to struggle a bit with a feminist approach. And I think also I've tended to move away from some of my older work where I spend a lot of time clarifying the difference between gender and feminist approaches, and they are very different. They work hand in hand together, but they're different. So I also learned a big lesson here is to bring that back in. I think a lot of people still struggle with the difference between these two kinds of approaches. And finally, I think overall, is to take a little more time and to slow down if we can in the next kind of evaluation that uses feminist principles evaluation, to really engage with people and help them understand how an FPE approach will benefit the entire evaluation process and the findings for the final report. Next slide. Yeah, so finally then just, yeah, thanks. The data inquiry that we used, so we've talked a little bit about the theory that underpins it. We used a mixed method. We used, as you can see, key informant groups, focus groups, group interviews, desk reviews, surveys. It was quite an intensive way of collecting data and different kinds of data that different groups of people would find credible. We looked at the information through the 3 module component studies, as Svetlana mentioned earlier, and we disaggregated where possible. It wasn't always possible to disaggregate. And we also looked at previous platform evaluations where we mined the data to see and to identify, if we could, to identify themes across the different evaluations that have recently taken place. Next slide. Karen or Samriti, I don't know if you want to jump in here because this is representing your work and you might want to talk about it a little bit more. No? Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to keep going. Is just here you're just looking at the kinds of interviews that were conducted and the kind of people that we were able to interview through the evaluation. Please note that some people were interviewed more than once. Some people were interviewed twice, some people 3 times at different stages during the evaluation. Our data analysis was iterative. So as we identified additional questions or gaps in our understanding or our knowledge, people were incredibly generous in this evaluation. And we're so grateful that they allowed us to do several interviews with them on different topics and with a different perspective. Next slide. And finally, just to note, why do I personally use feminist evaluation? And I think this is something I would love to engage my team on next time as well. Is for me, feminist evaluation, it forces me to see the world in different ways. I do think for this evaluation, it really broadened our understanding, leading to much better insights and much stronger recommendations than we would have had if we didn't use a feminist approach. It also encouraged us as a team to ask those really difficult questions that sometimes we were a little hesitant to ask, particularly when I say difficult, I'm talking around power structures. Engaging with the power structures, I think, was one of the more challenging aspects of doing this evaluation. And finally, I think it makes me a better evaluator because it makes me really think around, and our team really thinking around, we want to be treated the way that others are treated. Next slide. And these are just a few of the sources. Sorry, my neighbor is now deciding to cut trees. These are just a few of the sources of information that you may want to use where you can go in and learn a little bit more around feminist evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. At this juncture, we would like to have a 5-minute intermission where you can, if you want to raise your hand and pop your hand up or turn on your mic and ask some questions to Donna and to Svetlana on some of the points raised earlier about feminist evaluation, evaluability assessment, evaluating quality of science. If you want to make a comment or pop in some questions in the chat, this is the time.
I can't hear your voice now.
While we're on that, while you're thinking of your questions, we also invite you to go to menti.com because we know that most of you here have done some work around gender and evaluations. There are some challenges in evaluating gender using feminist approach or any gender responsive evaluations in general. So the Menti is about that. Speak to us about, in your opinion, what some of those challenges, what are some of those most pressing challenges? A recent FAO SWAP's Status of Women in Agri-Food Systems report highlighted the importance of generating high quality data. And that report, the Gender Platform contributed some background papers to. So speak to us about some of those challenges, rank them in order. That's what the Menti is about. So we'll present the results in the next Q&A session in a bit. Questions, comments, reactions, please. Okay. Thank you, Caroline. Caroline's asking, Caroline, do you want to speak to your question directly or is that fine? Okay, Caroline is asking, did the gender platform have a theory of change? If yes, how did it influence the evaluation? Donna, Svetlana, Tanya.
I'll go first. Yeah, it did have a theory of change, and we use a theory of change to design part of the methodology and to focus in on the different areas of the questions. But it was not an entirely theory driven evaluation.
You're muted, Svetlana.
Yes, sorry. I would just like to add that actually in the evaluability assessment, it did come out that the evaluant was interested in helping this evaluation think about their theory of change, because it was, as it was mentioned before, they went through the expansion of the scope from kind of focused on gender to gender, not the spelled out acronym, to social inclusion and youth. So at this point, with the results of this evaluation, we know that they are thinking about the theory of change and bringing the knowledge and learnings from this evaluation. So that's on the next steps more. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'll go to the last lead question. Sonal, can you speak to us about, we know that evaluations are not divorced from the realities of society. And that's the power of evaluations, that they are tuned to societal issues and they speak and they can ask the hard questions that Donna was referring to earlier. They can give voice to the less powerful and do the intricate legwork to elicit evidence base. So in your role as a member of the IAES ERG, you served as a peer review of some of the key outputs of the evaluation, and you provided expert feedback and advisory from a gender and evaluator lens. So speak to us about your perspective beyond the evaluant. What potential does this evaluation have to trickle down to creating change further downstream? How can evaluations at large act as bridges to ensure that they benefit the larger society and trickle down uptake beyond the evaluant? Can evaluations be used as advocacy tools? What are some drawbacks and limiting factors, and how can the transformative power of evaluations be better unlocked? Thank you. Over to Sonal.
Thank you very much. And thank you for a very thought-provoking question. Could we go for that? Yes, please keep that slide at the first one, please. The title slide. We've traditionally looked at evaluation for both accountability and learning. And although both of them are important, I think we need to add another dimension, and that's acknowledge transformation as a central paradigm for evaluation. And we know, we've experienced, we have discussed today that we have a planet in crisis, both in the natural and human world. And if we really want to transform our societies, our economies, and our relationships with nature, we have to have transformational change. And that's also the cornerstone of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. But before I delve into some of the questions that were raised and how evaluations can be transformative, such as the one of the gender platform, I just want to take a step back and unpack a little bit about what we mean by transformation. So the next slide, please. The gender platform evaluation is one example of what we could term as transformational change. Firstly, the platform is meant for diverse audience, evaluators, scientists, researchers. They form the core of the work that CGIAR does, and program designers. And so the discussion that one needs to have when we are evaluating such platforms is to go beyond incremental change, which is not enough. And so in the evidence module, that's one of the 3 modules, there are lots of examples of transformational change, which acknowledge that women are at the epicenter of climate change and adversely affected by it. And I think one needs to realize that change that addresses the root inequities that affect our societies, as well as methods and tools to investigate such change, are absolutely critical. And you must have all heard about the growing discussion on decolonization, localization, and decentralization. And these are all ways to find local solutions involving communities. And these have been highlighted in the many, many evidence explainers and stories that you see on the platform. I think the evaluation for me as a reviewer has also highlighted that if we want to transform societies, and one of the principles that Donna talked about is that we need to have not tokenistic, but genuine participation. So that's the co-learning bit. And the evaluation also looked at systemic change, which recognizes that any transformative change is complex. And if you try to change one area, you're likely to face backlashes. And so you have to evaluate change that's interconnected and holistic. And so some of the things that I've been talking about, authentic participation, transformation, systemic and structural change, all of these are a hallmark of feminist evaluation. And these were present as was mentioned in the gender platform evaluation. It had a very, very targeted focus on gender inequities, and it addressed local solutions, but in a global context. And at the same time, it looked at the complexities of changing systems in science. And this is really important for CGIAR. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that the evaluation also addressed intersectionality. It looked to the future. How do you involve youth? How do you ensure social inclusion? So to the next slide, please. So the key question is, how can evaluation meet the challenges to transform our societies, as well as our craft mean as evaluators? For that, evaluation cannot be an endpoint. It needs to be a process by which transformation takes place. And what do I mean by that? We need to ask questions related to the purpose of evaluation. Why are we doing what we do? What's the evaluation for? And who is it going to benefit? These are not that simple when you try to unpack them. And in the case of the gender platform evaluation, the evaluability assessment was a collaborative exercise with the gender platform management, gender specialists, the male specialists, and the independent evaluation function in the CGIAR system. And it's because of this collaborative exercise that I believe that there was insightful discussions on the terms of reference itself, so that the evaluation wasn't just about project outputs or outcomes as envisaged by the commissioners, but it really led to the honing of questions. Thus it empowered everyone who was consulted during the evaluation. In a sense, it was not an extractive process, but a very, very inclusive one. And I think this is a really marked shift from conventional evaluation, whose chief focus is really on accountability, what worked, and how efficiently that was achieved. One of the important decisions that I think any evaluation has to take is to determine which evaluation approach and methods to use. And we've heard today that there were certain selected approaches and methods, and they reflect the ideology or the lens through which we frame an evaluation. So in this case, the approaches used for the gender evaluation is feminist, utilization focused, and participatory. And I think the evaluation would not have been able to assess that change that we wanted to see in gender and equity and transformation if you had just picked up, say, a results-based assessment and you use that, you'd probably only then capture outputs, results, and targets, but not the why and the how. And I want to go into that in a little more detail in the next slide, please. So I think I can analyze what I want to say and put into three buckets. That's how, who, and for what. So when I'm talking about the how, and it means several things, I think first is the selection of the evaluator himself or herself. They need to have an equity, cultural, responsive, and innovative lens. So the selection is critical, just as critical as the selection of approaches and methods. So the evaluator for the gender platform had, and evaluators, there were many, had such a lens, and they were able to tweak those key evaluation questions in the analysis of findings so that they could address transformative change in gender inequity. And equally important for the how was the participatory co-creation of the TUR, as I mentioned, the evaluation methods, and the engagement with the evaluant throughout the evaluative process. And findings were also validated at the end of the evaluation through consultative workshops. So there was a lot of dialogue and discussion, and that avoided a judgmental view by the evaluator. So these perhaps soft approaches are absolutely foundational for evaluations if you want to ensure co-ownership. And by the way, in no way does it impact the rigor of the evaluation. Very, very important to note is that the evaluant or the management and the gender specialists of the gender platform, they were involved in the evaluability assessment, in modifying the TUR. So this timing is really unusual because we are addressing this design of the evaluation right from the beginning. And similarly, of course, the evaluant were involved in co-development of key questions, deep dives for each of the modules, and in reviewing the intermediary products. Having talked about how, I think the who is equally important, and that's the utilization-focused approach that was taken. And the users of the evaluation were identified very early on so that they could share what they wanted to know from the evaluation. And it was equally important to identify users both upstream and downstream, management at grassroots, gender focal points, scientists, and there are a lot of them in CGIAR, and implementers from the different sectors in the CGIAR family. CGIAR is basically a research organization, and hence the bulk of its personnel are scientists and researchers. And it was really important to involve them in the evaluation process, to sensitize them, if they were not already, of course, about how gender and equity are the root causes that impact the natural systems. So I think in the evaluation, they were consciously included, not just to extract information, but engaging them as users and therefore owners of the evaluation. And then finally, I want to come to the question, for what? What purpose is the evaluation for? And this is when we go beyond the usual what, and so the for what is looking at systemic change that's transformational and for the public good. And so the evaluation of the gender platform had, its three pillars: the methods, evidence, and alliance together. And as mentioned earlier, the principles that underpin the gender platform also enabled addressing the for what. In fact, these gender and equity related principles were mapped to the evaluation framework. So in answering the for what question, I think any good evaluation feeds into strategy and into rolling out of projects and initiatives. And the gender evaluation, I think, was no exception. It has helped to widen the scope to include youth and social inclusion, along with gender and equity, and the use of the evaluation to feed into broader gender-related intersectional strategies, which is very fundamental to any feminist approach and which advocates that these findings could lead to concrete changes in strategies and initiatives. So before I end, I would like to discuss my last slide, because we cannot talk about feminist evaluation or utilization-focused evaluation without discussing the role of communication and dissemination. So I think it's important to understand that we go beyond use to influence, and that's equally important for transformational change. And this includes both horizontal as well as vertical influence. There were several platforms that have been able to take these findings further. So peer-to-peer learning is available across various platforms. And I'm aware that CGIAR has a D group of gender specialists and focal points, over 200 of them, and a wider forum of program designers, innovators, and evaluators through a very strong Eval Forward community. And so the evaluation was, as we were moving along and discussing some of the issues, a lot of dissemination was happening both internally and externally. And the other platforms that have been used was the Eval Gender Plus. That's a 5,000 plus strong gender and evaluation community. And so when you begin to communicate, you build bridges of gender and evaluation specialists, along with the agricultural, land, and food systems that CGI represents. And this is really important to not only communicate internally, but externally as well. I do want to mention the role of the independent evaluation function, which steered the evaluation, and particularly its facilitative role, which meant creating a very enabling environment so that the expert group, of whom I am a member, we could communicate, not as a one-off, but from the beginning to the end, and ensuring that the feedback loops were addressed. And personally, I found the process really enriching because as part of the review team, I, along with the other colleagues, we were involved from the evaluability assessment onwards to the inception, right to the final reporting. And I think our inputs were richer because of this process. And I'm really happy to note that the independent evaluation function is actively pursuing dissemination communication, targeting different audiences, so that the findings of the evaluation will be used widely. And I think these are the elements that I wanted to highlight for a transformational evaluation: the co-creation, the co-analysis, the co-validation, using evidence in a transparent way, communication to targeted audiences, and leading that to co-use and to co-influence. Thank you very much for your attention.
Powerful. Thank you, Sonal. Co-influence, very key in transformative and in engendering transformation. We have some questions, a question in the chat that I would like all the panelists to speak to. Very thought-provoking question. Katharina, if you're comfortable, can you speak to this question you have in the chat? Okay, I can't hear you, Ekaterina. If it's okay, if it's okay, if you could speak to it, it will be great. Otherwise, I can read it out for the panelists. You can just unmute your mic if it's fine with you. Thank you. Okay, I take the silence to mean I should read it out. So the question, Ekaterina's question is, what was the biggest challenge during the evaluation of the CGIAR Gender Platform? So I would like for each of the three panelists to speak to it. It's very topical, very pertinent, and very much in line with some of the ranking question we asked in the Menti earlier. So Sonal, since you're the first I see on my screen, can you please react to Ekaterina's question? From your lens as an evaluator gender and with your role in the evaluation as a member of the evaluation reference group and the expert advisory you provided and the external review of the outputs that you provided. Thank you.
You'd like me to go forward, Karen?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
I think as part of the reference group, what we did is that we challenged the team a great deal in ensuring that we were addressing not just gender, but a feminist approach. And when I talk about that is that asking the questions that was there change systemically or structurally, and to ensure that those questions were there. So we wanted to focus on what sort of change happened. Was the platform able to address in its evidence and the explainers and the research it was doing, whether it was questioning the inequities, the root inequities that women and youth and so on face. And I think we had very pertinent questions, so that if you are able to hone your key questions carefully and able to ask that to a variety of stakeholders, you actually understand where the bottlenecks are and where the barriers are. And I hope we didn't give too hard a time to the evaluators.
Thank you, Sonal. So arriving at that point, the convergence where you're honing the key questions was in itself a challenge. Thank you. And when we finally came through, it's like, thank you very much. Donna, do you want to speak to us from your perspective as a team leader? What was the biggest challenge during this evaluation?
Sure. Just to comment on what Sonal said. I mean, I think we found the feedback from the reviewers, all of it, to be immensely helpful. And I think a feminist evaluation, more so than any other kind of evaluation, needs to be impeccable. And we were only able to get there because of the kinds of feedback that Sonal and her team gave. So we're very grateful for that. I think the most difficult thing is that all evaluations are political, but this evaluation was incredibly political. And we were, I think, I'll speak on behalf of the team a bit here. I think we were pulled a bit in different directions sometimes. Any evaluation has to have a key user group, and you often tend to, hone those questions, focus that data analysis so that the key user group can use the information to make a management decision. And in this evaluation, we had 3 key user groups, and their needs did not always overlap. So I think the biggest challenge was negotiating and engaging with those 3 key user groups to ensure that they all were able to get the information that they needed to make their decisions moving forward.
Comments, new perspectives from one of the key user groups perspective? Over.
Karen, did you want, who is answering the next question, or who's asking the next question? Sorry.
You were reacting to the question. So the question is, from your perspective, what was the biggest challenge during this evaluation?
I will briefly speak, and Karen, you would be the next one to answer this question as the manager of this evaluation. So just FYI. I think for leading evaluation function in CGIAR, the big challenge has been and will continue, and in this evaluation inclusive, is the science interaction, the research for development context. And when we've highlighted this before, but it's not just scientists and researchers, it's social scientists and hard science researchers. So this human aspect, highlighting this role of human aspect and human rights and feminism and the need for social interactions and attention to social capital of work and delivery mechanisms is something that has been challenging. And going forward, the big challenge, and hopefully not a difficult one, but let's see, is making this evaluation come alive. Not just kind of dissemination, but making this evaluation shine and implementation of the recommendations. We do have a system for tracking the implementation of recommendations, but the development of the actual management response is a very exciting step where we have been specifically instructed already by the gender platform to make sure that everybody's at the table. Because the recommendations coming from evaluation of gender platform do not only relate to the gender platform, but they are systemic and they are cross-cutting, and they would help make CGIAR at large much more gender responsive and gender focused. So Karen, off to you.
We lost you for a bit, Svetlana.
Karen, off to you.
Okay, sorry, my internet connection is a bit unstable. Before I react, Tanya would like to, Tanya is a member of the evaluation team. She's one of the SMEs that took the, that led the evaluation of the module, the evidence module. You saw the evidence explainers earlier. She would like to react to this thought-provoking question. Thank you. Over to you, Tanya. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. So just a few thoughts on this. I think some of the challenges included things like the time frames. Yeah, it's participatory research or work, and that already adds time, but also kind of the participatory nature of the review by the gender platform and by the independent reviewers adds kind of further time. So I think that was kind of quite a challenge to manage some of that. And the kind of approach that we used, or the quality of research for development framework that we used, involves actually kind of digging deep into the details of kind of understanding what are the different aspects of design of the work that they're doing, and then understanding how they did that, the different inputs, the different processes, the outputs. And I think that kind of real in-depth digging kind of, it obviously adds interview time, but it also adds kind of analysis time and things like that. But it also adds real richness to the data, I think, because there's a real kind of understanding and unpacking and discussion around it that kind of leads to a lot of reflection as well, I think, by the evaluand and certainly and by the evaluators in that kind of discussion. So that kind of co-learning that comes out of it. I think another challenge was the timing of the evaluation in the platform's life stage or cycle or length of life so far, that it's only been in existence for a couple of years. So it's quite early on. And for the evidence module that I was involved in evaluating, many of the kind of, their findings and the outcomes from the work that they'd commissioned and issued grants for, they had 37 different research projects and evidence syntheses, gap maps and things, systematic reviews and things, was only just coming through. So that was kind of quite an interesting and in some ways quite challenging phase to be looking at it. So a lot of it really was about the process as opposed to about the output that was coming out as a result of that. And I think another area was stakeholder engagement. I think if the focus of the evaluation kind of picks up that in some ways there hasn't been huge amounts of diverse stakeholders involved in those activities, say in a systematic review or something like that at the early design stages, then it's quite difficult for the evaluators to reach out to that broader group of stakeholders if they have, just are utterly unaware that that work has yet gone on. So in some of the areas there was that, but obviously we had 37 different projects within the module. So some of them had been, developed in a real action learning kind of way with local stakeholders. And so that was a completely different situation. Others had been developed kind of purely at a kind of research level, looking kind of at synthesizing all the evidence at a global level across it. So there'd perhaps been less involvement of stakeholders. So I think those are just a few things to add there from our experiences. Over.
Thank you, Tanya. In CAP, I must say to summarize, I would say that from drawing lessons from this evaluations of that are gender responsive and incorporate different lenses and different approaches, such as those used in this evaluation: participatory approach, theory-driven, utilization focus, and feminist approaches should be they should be considered as huge investments in terms of time. There should be a flexible timeline. So when planning for these evaluations, you should know that participation is expensive and it is well worth it in the end. So on the planning side, it's good to have longer time frames to make sure that the evaluation has depth and breadth, and and to have the team and the evaluant engage will take more dialogue and more deeper stakeholder engagement. So these kind of evaluations take time and are well worth it. Any other questions? We have 4 minutes to wrap up at this moment. Since we do not have any questions, may I call on Svetlana to take us through the next steps in the evaluation, and then we can project the ranked order of challenges with regards to other gender responsive evaluations. Thank you. Over. Samriti, please, can you take us through the next slide, and then Svetlana will wrap us up. And see you. So in terms of the next steps for these related to these, the platform evaluation, so the evaluant with IAES are co-creating a shared knowledge management approach. So now referred earlier about co-influencing. So it's important, this whole co-influencing has to come with co-creation with the different actors. So IAES will be doing lots of co-creation with the evaluate and other user groups, and they would leverage key internal moments within CGIAR and external conferences to disseminate the findings so that it trickles down beyond the key user groups and further downstream, and to connect this evaluation with the other planned evaluations in IAES's multi-year evaluation plan. Thank you all so much for your time today. We have had a great time at this session. At this moment, Samriti, if it's possible to project the ranked order of the mentee, it would be much appreciated. Yes, so speaking back to the challenges, the first thing ranked was the weak monitoring and the coordination mechanism. So we have limited availability of sex disaggregated data, very much in tune with the FAO SWOS report, what was highlighted in the SWOS report. Second, we have ensuring meaningful participation and inclusion with less powerful voices, and we know this takes a lot of time and planning. Third, finding requisite expertise, gender expertise. In this evaluation, there was a multidisciplinary team. All team members had requisite experiences in gender and food systems research, and it was gathering the team together. It took a lot of time. Fourth, gender responsive evaluations are more expensive in terms of time and resources. And finally, addressing cultural and societal norms that perpetuate gender inequalities. With this, we'd like to say thank you all for today, and we would keep in touch with the participants and invite you to watch the recording. We'll send post event summaries, and to stay tuned. The report will be published as soon as possible. I will keep you in the know. Thank you very much. Final comment from any of the panelists is also welcome. Thank you. Okay, I take silence as non-committed. So with this, as moderator, may I call it it's a wrap from us. Thank you all for attending this session. Thank you. Bye, everyone.